Hello again and welcome back. In this instalment of our journey through the Oracle of the Hekatean Path, we're going to be looking at cards 31 through to 36. So go on, fire away, because this was another highlight for me visually.
Yeah, this is the Dark Moon card. So this is the card of release, and obviously when people come to get to know Hecate and start to sort of honor and worship her, they'll realize that the Dark Moon is her sacred time, her sacred night. Obviously, as we mentioned with the new moon card, the ancient Greeks calendar was lunar based. So the new moon would be the start, the dark moon would be the end. But obviously they didn't have handy little apps like we do, where we can chart, every increment of the moon's phase. So obviously they had to rely on a rough system, but obviously looking at the sky itself. So the dark moon really would have sort of covered about 3 days at the end of the month, when the moon is mostly in shadow and also doesn't rise very high, so you don't actually see it. And in that period, the honors and the sacrifices and stuff would be made to sort of the chthonic gods, the underworld gods, and then obviously on the last night it was Hecate specifically. And the notion behind her dark moon sacrifices is it was, I suppose, in a way, this cyclical getting rid of everything. I mean, some of the examples of ancient offerings you wouldn't necessarily think of in our modern context, where things like the incense ash and the broken potsherds from the censers, the scraps of food and things.
You surprised me with all of that, because that's not what I would have expected when
that would have all been gathered up and then deposited at the crossroads as an offering, but also it's a cathartic sort of cleansing action. But like in our modern senses, you wouldn't think, oh well, I'm just going to stick the rubbish bin on, in front of the altar kind of thing. And I mean that is quite a literal sort of comparison. But
it's interesting though, isn't it? Because as we're going through these cards, they're all starting to tie together in a way that they didn't even when we were creating them. I think because the creative process was long and drawn out. Whereas as we've been filming this, we've filmed them over the course of a week, haven't we? And it's great for me because I'm getting this guided tour through the deck. But what's really hitting me here, we're talking about all the detritus being left as offerings, at the crossroads and what have you. And it's just immediately taking me back to Barbara Fora, consumer of filth, and
exactly.
All of these different aspects are now starting to bond together beautifully,
Yeah. And that's that's the poetic nature of it, of any form of divinationary tool, that you can go through them in an order, but they do interplay with each other, and then obviously as they become drawn in readings, they have completely different interplay each time. And I think this was another one of those cards where I just knew in my head what I wanted it to look like. And obviously, to show the absence of the moon, but still obviously have an image that sort of says that it's the moon. It's,
I just thought what you did here was a stroke of genius. I would not have thought of this.
Yeah.
But to actually depict the dark moon, sort of as an eclipse, it really, you can show the dark moon, but I mean, as you say, as we would normally see it or not see it in the sky, it is invisible. But this really, I just thought this was just a clever approach. I wouldn't have thought of this, and it does kind of bring the concept home, albeit not in a literal way,
And the coronas and sort of aura stuff around it kind of then sort of filters through into the mists that and the dogs howling I mean, you know, they're howling at the moon, but they're howling at the dark moon. They're howling at Hecate's moon, and then this sort of ambiguous hooded figure, you know, quite sort of big, heavy cloak on.
Mhm.
That, you know, most of the face is occluded, but you're this is Hecate's time. You know,
Yeah.
this is. I think there's a drama to the card, the sort of an air of drama.
There's a it's a time of hiddenness, isn't it?
Yeah.
And sort of, I think what I loved about this is the fact that it was the veiled figure, you know, the sort of, in real terms, the lack of light, the secrecy of it, but also it's almost like an incubation period. It's like the darkness of a womb, isn't it? You know,
Yeah.
it's gestation, it's beginnings. You know, once that sliver of the ascendant moon starts to show, then you're into kind of a birthing and growth sort of period. But this is pure. This is hibernation. It's gestation. It's secrecy.
It's
It's
the pregnant
darkness.
pause, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
And you know, if you look at it alongside the full moon card that we discussed in the previous one, you know,
Yeah.
where the figure in that one is, you know, reaching out for the moon and pulling it close. This one is almost the complete opposite, where it's all very, it's very static and very almost solemn in its sort of reverence.
Yeah, yeah. It was, I mean, as my perspective as the artist, this was one of the easiest cards to do.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you had I mean, I think the danger with a card like this is that when something, you know, technically goes very straightforward and there's no hitches, and then you come up with your finished result very quickly, which we did. You know, you think, well, is it too simplistic? But actually, no, this said everything it needed to. And I think using the corona laws behind the moon, I just think it was a beautiful touch, because it does the black. I mean, it's kind of almost the darkness of the moon on this card for me is almost like a pit that you're going to sink into.
Yeah.
And it just feels right. But then it's everything. Again, this is kind of one of the cards that brings the rawness of the deck out to me, because she is nowhere in sight, but you can feel her presence in everything in the card just because of the reaction of everything else that's there.
Yeah,
you know?
And sometimes that is her. That you know, that's how it's an odd thing to describe that her immanence is illustrated by her absence.
Yeah,
but there are passages in ancient sources where it talks about these howling dogs. You know, the winds pick up, the dogs are howling, and that is the precursor of the goddess's arrival. And so I think we've got that here, because we've not really sort of said, oh, you know, here's the goddess. We've just got this very dark and very mysterious pregnant pause at the end of this, you know, of this lunar cycle.
Yeah.
And yet you can almost hear in anticipation her arrival.
It's funny. You know me, I'm a massive Trekkie. I'm going to draw a parallel that really brings home the creepiness of this card to me. It gets slated as a film, but I do love Star Trek Nemesis, which was the last of the Star Trek Next Generation films. But there's a very eerie moment towards the climax of that film where sort of Deanna Troi, the telepathic character, is sort of in telepathic battle with the enemy, and she's searching them out with their mind. And it's just one of the most, it sends a shiver down your spine as a moment in the film, because, you know, you've got this alien at the console and all of a sudden he just freezes, and in a really cold voice he says, "She's here." And two simple words, but as I say, it's literally one of the most spine-chilling moments of the film, because it does obviously spell the downfall of the particular villain in that film. But it does remind me very much of this, in that, you know, in her, you know, in her lunar aspect, she's cloaked in a veil of invisibility at the dark moon. But in a way, that's kind of one of the times of the month where you sense her the most. And it's that sort of intangible presence that, as I say, that hence me drawing parallel with the film, and that's what it evokes for me, you know. And certainly with the howling of the dogs, where you would expect them to be howling at the full moon, whereas they're howling at what they can't see, which is a very powerful statement for me, of the goddess's power. And also, it's a case of look for inspiration when you can least see it or least expect it. That's the other thing it says very much to me. But I'm fascinated by what we've already talked about with regards to offerings, and it's particularly pertinent with the next card, isn't it? Number 32.
Yes.
Now, this really fascinates me because this took me, when you explained this aspect to me initially, this was nothing like I expected. I think maybe it's silly preconceived prejudices coming out of patriarchal religion, that all pagan sacrifices are gory and blood-ridden. And here we are with this one, card 32, Hecate's Deepnon. And the sacrifices, the offering is a meal. The key word on this is sacrifice, but it's not what I expected. Tell me some more about this.
So, like you say, everybody that comes from a sort of westernized, Christianized background has this assumption that pagan sacrifice was, people and animals and, on that kind of thing. And, there was that element in certain aspects of it. But with Hecate, because of her, I suppose her devotion from the sort of the more personable side of things, the household religion, as it's termed, obviously, people couldn't afford to be slaughtering a cow every month, or they would need those for their survival. It was only the big sort of city-based festivals where huge amounts of cattle were usually offered, in sacrifice, and that was possibly like an annual thing rather than a monthly sort of thing. And the idea of these simple food offerings, you find them all through ancient sort of Greek religion. Things like the first morsel of food and the last morsel of food being offered to Hestia, because she was very much in the home. She was the half fire. The Agathos daemon, sprinkling wine onto the floor. I mean, obviously nowadays, we would think, oh no, you're not sprinkling wine on my carpets and stuff. But obviously back then it was a dirt floor. It was a different understanding of the unity of earth and these offerings. So with Hecate's Deipnon, there is a line, and I don't know if I actually got it written down here. Just trying to see if I've got it on my notes, and I don't have it yet. But basically, it basically is a commentary, and it basically sort of hints at when people make offerings of these meals at the crossroads. The poor and disenfranchised take them away before Hecate even has a chance to come and get them. That's the basic gist. And it's this notion that these offerings that are left out are actually just taken by people or by animals, and rather than the goddess. And then there's this sort of warning about leaving your offerings, that when you leave them, you walk away and you don't look back, regardless of what you hear. And so it's almost as this, it always became this thing that you might hear some movement behind you taking the food, but the superstitious side says don't look back, because it might be a beggar, it might be a dog, or it could be the goddess, and if you do, you might come a cropper, basically. But these simple food-based offerings were things like garlic and eggs, and they might have been things like honey, possibly bread-based things. There's been we've already talked about offerings of things like sweepings and ash and such like that. But obviously, in this day and age, we don't particularly want to offer necessarily animal products. A lot of people don't consume them anymore. And we also we don't really want to be wasteful in our in society, especially where food's concerned. So there are ways where modern devotees have kind of bridged the gap. So rather than leave food out in nature, especially these, there are certain things that we couldn't leave out because they would be harmful to the environment. You couldn't throw salt outside; that's going to damage things. Leaving chocolate or something out, that's dangerous to animals. So certain people will donate to food drives and food banks as a devotional act, or some of them help out at homeless shelters, food kitchens and things like that, so that they're still tapping into this thing, and it's a devotional act, and so they sort of pass the devotion through these what become sacred acts, basically.
And actually, it's fulfilling the same purpose, because although there is a tradition of leave your offering at the crossroads and don't look back, the reality is a lot of people would have known that they would be leaving their offering there for the goddess, but also for the poor, And so, ironically, as you say, I mean, the offering is adapted, but actually that concept of leaving your offering for somebody who is in need, as well as for the goddess, is equally honoured today as it was back then, isn't it?
Yeah. And the notion of the card representing sacrifices, it's again, this is it's a loaded term, and it's one that's quite emotive, but it's one that gets you thinking what is a sacrifice, because it's not just about giving up something that you might necessarily feel is important. It can be things like time, and it doesn't have to necessarily be money or objects of perceived worth. There's a lot more of a deeper understanding of what sacrifice can actually be in certainly in religious terms.
Yes. I mean, I've got to give you all kudos for this. I've got a confession to make. This is the card that intimidated me the most, and not for reasons you'd think. Because when you actually gave me the brief for this, and you said, right, we've just got to show a plate of food. And my first thought, don't laugh, my first thought is, how do I do this without it looking like something out of a Delia cookbook? So actually, for anyone who's outside of the UK, if you're watching this, just to kind of give you a bit of context, that we have another great modern goddess in this country called the goddess Delia, and Ken and I grew up with her, usually on a Wednesday night on BBC Two, and she was at the time the UK's most foremost female lady master chef. And the great goddess Delia is still revered to this day. I've got 2 of her cookbooks on my bookshelf, but it was the challenge of, how do you, when you're literally just presenting a plate visually, how do you bring the sort of mystical element to that? But thankfully, you kind of guided me through it, and we went for something sort of quite dark, didn't we? It's quite literal on one level.
Yeah.
But on another level, it's,
the traditional deep nun would have been offered on the dark moon, and so if you were venturing to those remote crossroads and leaving this simple offering, it wouldn't be very well lit. It wouldn't, but we didn't obviously want to make it so dark that you couldn't see what was actually there.
Yeah.
And I know at the time when I was saying, I was explaining, I was like, right, I want some garlic, and I want an egg and a bit of bread, but obviously we're having to source separate images for all of these things, and you're putting them together on this plate image, and then you're like, this is just going to look all hodgepodge together. I was like, no, just keep going. I was like, right, don't look at what's in the plate. I said, now let's look at layers, let's look at colours, let's look at tone. We just kept adding on to it. And then all of a sudden, I think you just put the last little texture on, and I went, there you go.
I'm just thinking for American viewers, just to put this into, I mean, I'm sat there at the computer thinking, oh my God, he's channeling Delia here. I mean, I think, what's the American lady called? Is it Julia Childs?
Oh yeah, she was.
Yeah. For American viewers, yeah, Delia is our Julia, you know. So I think, yeah, you did good on this one. You kind of got the point over without channeling the goddess Delia. But I think this is one of the more fascinating cards because it's very earthiness, and it's the mundane quality of it, and yet it actually, even just from what we've said over the last few minutes, it actually expresses a whole range of meaning and questions that very often, I mean, certainly I took for granted.
Yeah,
you know, say the nature of sacrifice, the nature of giving, and yeah, it's a very simple but very beautiful card, and one that I think is right there at the heart of the deck. You know, because I think that concept of sacrifice and giving is central. You know, certainly within an oracle deck, it's a very, very valid concept to be there right at the center. So I love it. It was one of the most difficult, but not for the reasons that I would have thought. So sometimes simple actually causes a lot more problems than complex, doesn't it?
True.
So, moving on, number 33. This was an interesting one. The Black Hound, and the keyword on this is loyalty, isn't it? So you've touched on this, but explain the significance again of the hounds with regards to Hecate.
So dogs have been quite long associated with Hecate, either as like a companion animal. There is talking back on sacrifice, there are references to like black puppies and black bitches being sacrificed to Hecate for various reasons. But obviously our modern sensibilities, our brains don't quite understand that properly. But if you have a knowledge of the times and the rituals and things that it was, that those things were happening in, it makes sense to that, that time period. But yeah, the dog is probably, I think, next to the torch, is probably one of the most iconic symbols that a lot of people will associate with Hecate. Obviously, you've got then the sort of connections to things like Kerberos, the three-headed hound of the underworld, and so again we've got this thing of the barking of dogs, the howling of dogs, the keening of dogs. They're associated with the sort of the goddess's immanence, even if you can't physically sort of perceive her. Those are the signs that she's around, or that she's coming.
You've just reminded me, because in the Mythic Tarot, the moon card actually depicts Hecate, doesn't it? But she's depicted accompanied by Kerberos, if I remember right.
Yeah, it's like is it
three-headed?
It is three heads, yeah.
But
it's like a greyhound, sort of sleek, sort of white dog. But yeah, that's even back then in '86 when I was looking at it, it was there. And then obviously, then when you think about sort of our modern connections with dogs, this notion of them, man's best friend. They're guides. They, especially when you look at assistance dogs, seeing eye dogs and things like that. They assist, and that they are, by their very nature, loyal to their master or mistress, because that's just that's their role in this. And yet, when we had this card, and I knew, obviously it was a given that it was going to be in the deck, but obviously I didn't want it to be too sort of, not Scooby-Doo, but I didn't want it to be too light and airy and, it's man's best friend. But I didn't want it to be, oh my God, this is a slavering hellhound and I don't really want to go anywhere near it. I kind of wanted to find a middle ground with it.
I think you certainly did that.
Because although this dog is sat in the middle of the path and it is staring at you with these piercing coal, red coal of eyes, it's got its sort of tongue slightly out and it's not particularly threatening in its immediate sort of positioning. Yet the darkness and the wilderness and the fact that there's one up on the mountain at the back, there are the hints that things could go either way. And the thing what I find with this one is often with Hecate, when we sort of feel that Hecate's presence is not around or we feel maybe lost, I often find that the dog is kind of like the precursor that will lead us back onto the path. Often the dog the hound shows up when we've strayed. And then obviously, we can draw them parallels as well into things like, in psychology terms, the black dog, i.e. depression. There are a lot of those kind of things that can lead to aspects of like dark night of the soul, which is often the time when many of us first encounter Hecate. I know for me it is. And so that again, you've got a multi-layered and pretty much eternal symbol of a dog or a hound, and it's inextricably linked to Hecate. They're loyal to her. They can be loyal to us, and in a roundabout way, we need to be loyal to Hecate.
Yeah, it's interesting, the unpredictability of this. That's one of the things that it really drew me to this card. And it's interesting because again, I mean, I'll draw a not necessarily expected parallel. I was just reminded as you were talking then of C.S. Lewis and the Narnia Chronicles, because there was a similar thing with him. How do you depict a talking lion, a benevolent talking lion, and in this case a metaphor for Jesus as he was using it, but in a way that is not just sort of cuddly and warm. And there's that phrase in those books that that comes up time and time again: he's not a tame lion. And again, there is that similar aspect here in that the dog actually, as you say, on some levels is very benign, but the glowing eyes actually, and the fact that you can see the silhouette of another one in the distance. If you were walking this path and then were faced with this dog, it's like this could go either way.
And I think most of us with even half a brain cell would react in the right way if we saw that in ahead of us. We would be.
It's like trespassing and then coming across a guard dog, isn't it? That, I mean, it's interesting, the loyalty aspect here, full well that if you play the game, and in the case with the guard dog, if you walk away, the guard dog will then leave you alone. Whereas if you choose to trespass, the guard dog will very definitely not leave you alone. And I think the inference with this is, follow the right path and the dog will follow you every step of the way. Go down the wrong path and, it will invoke Hecate's wrath on you. That's the kind of sense that I get with this. And but that's a principle that runs through everyday life and through nature, isn't it? It's, the dog, the guard dog is a symbol of boundaries, and
the guide dog, is consistent. And that's it. And that's where that's where I see this card. It's the guide or the guard. It's and then you've got to then ask the questions based on other cards in a reading or where you are in a situation as to which interpretation that's going to be. And I dare say that when the card shows up, it will let you know one way or another just from the tone of it. Because I experience this with reading tarot and stuff, especially obviously using your healing light when that led to this. There are times when I've drawn cards in readings and they've either not glowed, but the colours have either been very intense or they've been very muted, and then that's telling of how to interpret that particular card in that particular reading. And I think the same will come from this. There will be times where you think, oh, it's a doggy, and then there'll be other times of, oh my god, it's a hellhound.
One like hell. Yeah. It's funny you saying about the healing light. We've done some mean readings combining the decks, haven't we?
Oh yes.
Yeah. So now let's have a look at one of the more intriguing cards of the deck.
And I think was one of the later editions, I think. I don't think I initially had this in mind.
This wasn't in your initial brief. And did we take another card out for this? I can't remember.
Possibly, or we may have combined some of the cards into one.
That sounds more like it. I think there was two that were combined into one, and then it was, This is number 34. This is pharmaka.
Yeah.
With the keyword of knowledge. So what kind of knowledge are we talking?
So obviously pharmaka is this notion, this knowledge base of drugs, of poisons in a sort of witchcraft context. That's where this is where this root word comes from. Medea, the priestess of Hecate, is skilled in it. She can use herbs to heal or to kill. Most of the things that she does to help Jason involves her her knowledge. She makes a salve for his skin when the fire breathing bull, and so she doesn't so he doesn't get damaged and things. So it's quite inextricably linked with sort of witches and obviously Hecate because of the herb based knowledge, and obviously so many plants, so especially like banes, like the wolfsbane and mandrake and all that. They're very they're all associated with Hecate as well. And I think what it was that brought me to put this card in was obviously we'd already used the card to represent aconite, which is one of the most, I suppose, probably the most famous of herbs associated with Hecate. But I didn't want to then start adding more and then end up with so many cards that could have probably been an oracle deck on their own. And I think there's probably enough herb-based oracle decks out there now. So what I wanted to sort of do was combine what they would, what they all pretty much would say individually, but also, when they're lumped together. And I took this inspiration from, it's called a palimpsest, and basically it's an old manuscript of from whenever, medieval times or whatever, but over time people have written other things over the top of it, and so you get this multi-layering of writings and such. And I wanted it to be almost like an old palimpsest or grimoire page where lots of different things had overlapped on it. And I know again we kind of not butted heads, but I know that I was finding it difficult to explain adequately for your artistic mind.
It's you've got me in one, love, because one of my friends actually openly refers to me as being somewhere in the ultraviolet or X-ray range of on the spectrum. So you did have your work cut out here, but it's intriguing. I mean, you said about the mandrake. I mean, the figure on this card, in the manuscript, is that like a sort of personification of a mandrake or something like that? So
I mean, obviously mandrake is often seen in because its roots take this sort of humanesque shape. And again, there are male and female roots or versions of it. And I opted for the female version mostly because when we're thinking about the history of practicing witches, and certainly in relation to Hecate, they predominantly were women, and so I wanted to keep that sort of connection to this feminine knowledge of this, and the fact that some of the myth around harvesting mandrake, we all know that the legends are that if you pull a mandrake out, the scream will kill you. Well, in medieval times, they used to use dogs So in order to harvest one, what you would basically do was you would starve a dog till it was absolutely yampy for food, and
Really?
then you would tie its lead around the the root stem of the mandrake. Then you would basically put food or throw food in the opposite direction, and then as it ran for the food, it would pull the mandrake up. The mandrake would scream, the dog would drop dead, and then you could go and get your mandrake. And
Well,
so
that's
again,
pretty
you've
kind
got
of a dog, isn't it?
yeah, well, yes, again, but again, you've kind of got that tie-in between both the herbs and the dog and Hecate, sort of inadvertently in the middle. And I
Yeah.
think I think we did layer some of the other herbs that are associated. I mean, if you look, you'll start to see them. We've
Yeah.
got dandelion and garlic, and I think was it wormwood and belladonna? I think
That's right. Yeah.
possibly, but
To me,
obviously, again, the more you look, I suppose, the more you will see.
this is one of the more intriguing cards in the deck. I think because it fits in visually, but it's visually very different from anything else that's here, and also very different from anything that I normally do. It's the fact that it's multi-layered. It's funny. This has kind of inspired me because one of the projects that I've been working on, and I've never quite got it into the form I wanted, but I was inspired years ago. I went to the British Museum to have a look through their collection of antique tarots, and there was a copy of, I think it was an original Convert Marseille, from the 1900s, but it had basically been annotated over and over again by whoever had owned it. And it had become like a palimpsest in that it was covered in notes. And obviously whoever had previously owned this deck was an occultist, because it was annotated notes, it was occult symbols. And it fascinated me. It was just layer upon layer of meaning. And I know when we were doing this card, when I finally got it, that was in the back of my head. And I've actually sort of been working on a tarot in a similar style, but it's kind of one of those things. I haven't quite got it yet, and it'll probably take another revision or so before I kind of get the form. But it's that intrigue of an old manuscript that's been added to, annotated, extra layers, things stuck into it.
And I kind of wanted to touch this whole notion of it being knowledge. Is knowledge and power are things that are quite closely associated, but you've got like the poisons. You can, if you know what you're doing, if you have the right knowledge, then you can use a deadly poison to affect something. Sometimes you can do it in a healing way if the correct preparation, the correct dosage, and all that kind of thing. So I wanted to kind of draw on that, and so that it can kind of hint at, don't necessarily do things if you don't actually have the knowledge base behind it. You kind of got, sometimes you have to take the time to learn, because you, like this palimpsest style, you've got to layer up all of this information to before you have a sound knowledge base from which to act.
There's also that lesson time and time again, in magic and ritual magic of, you see it with the fairy tale of the Sorcerer's Apprentice. It's one thing to have the spell book, it's another thing to have the wisdom and the maturity to use it in a way that is not going to cause chaos.
Exactly.
So
I think the mandrake illustrates that quite readily, because if you just go, oh yeah, it's a mandrake, and pull it up, the scream will kill you. But if if you've done your homework, so to speak, and you have the knowledge, then unfortunately for in figurative terms, unfortunately for the dog that you then employ to harvest your mandrake, but you will have used your knowledge effectively to get the end result. And I think that's the core of this card. Is it's about understanding what knowledge is and employing it adequately.
That's one of the more fascinating ones. Let's move on to actually, I think probably one of my two favorites visually, one of my three favorites visually. There's three real standouts for me, and this is one of them. Card 35, voeis magikai, and the keywords on this are raising power. This was an early one, but again, it's just always stood out for me as just one of the most magical concepts that you brought to this deck, and one of the ones that was the biggest joy to create. I love this image.
Yeah, and I mean, I suppose when if you're taking words and you're trying to make an image with them, it's not always necessarily the easiest thing to do. I mean, voeis magikai in relation to sort of Hekatean and magic in general, they are most often found in things like the Greek magical papyri. They are strings of, for what we can see, largely nonsensical words or vowels or, long drawn out sounds. They're often sometimes referred to as barbarous words, because they are words that we've lost or don't have a meaning for, but clearly they were of some use and some import, that they were recorded and used within magical context. Now, the particular voeis magica that I wanted to represent with this one have become more well known through the rite of the sacred fires. They're a string of voeis magicae, sometimes referred to as the Ephesian letters. And so it's Aske, Kataske, Eron, Orion, Ior, Mega, Samnie, Bowie, and then Phobantia Semne at the end. And that's it. In the Rite of the Sacred Fires, that's intoned 3 times, and then the Phobantia Semne is tacked on at the end. I mean, it can be done more than 3 times, and in that respect, it becomes this sort of chant and sort of, again, this ability to raise energy with these ancient words that have resonance, even though we don't actually know specifically what they are for or what they mean. And so I think I kind of left you to this one, because I just sort of said what it was, and I was like, but I don't know how I'm going to do it.
It's weird. This is the only one where it was kind of a bit of a role reversal, wasn't it? Because, I mean, you had a very clear concept, but then said to me, I don't know how we're going to achieve this. Whereas immediately you said what this was, there was just a kind of, I was really inspired by it. And I just immediately says, I know how we can do this. And I just saw this absolute sea of golden energy, which is kind of what we've ended up with, isn't it? With a sort of vortex of overlapping stars and elemental triangles. And then obviously that's between 2 faces who were invoking these words. I mean, I think the one thing that we need to point out here, this also has significance for the card backs, doesn't it? Because the same voeis magikai invocation is featured on the backs of the cards, which is actually, to me, is the most personal thing in the deck, because we based the card backs on one of your tattoos, didn't we? We actually took a photograph of your tattoo, and then I traced around it intricately in Photoshop to create the card back. But obviously surrounding this sort of Hekatean wheel is that very invocation. So again, it's a very central card in the deck for me, because this image just completely encapsulates the power of the deck and the power of invocation. I love it. I mean, I do. I'm very fond, I love the whole deck, but this image I have a real passion for, because I mean, it's nothing new, is it? I mean, to me, ultimately, this is the power of words. Words have the power to inspire. They have the power to sort of shake us, to shock us, to disturb us, to undermine us, to build us up. Words have the power to send shivers down our spine. They're very magical things, and I think that's what this card pays homage to.
And I think, even though the baser meanings might be lost in time, the fact that we still use them, and that they have an effect, they have a resonance. And I think you can almost, the way that you've layered the words and the sort of the energy of this card, it makes the image I mean, this might be my neurodivergency, but for me, it makes the image audible.
Yeah,
Because I
it's.
mean, obviously, I know the words, so
Yeah,
I can kind of see them building on themselves.
I
And
think
yeah,
one of the
it's
reasons we work so well is because we are both neurodivergent. I'm also mildly synesthesic. I think you are as well.
mm,
I'm not as synesthesic as some people are, but I do. Words evoke sounds, words evoke images in my brain, sounds evoke colors. And this is one of those cards that pays homage to that crossover.
mm,
I don't think in reality that words, images, musical notes, sounds, tastes, textures, smells, all of those things, they're much more interconnected than we give them credit for. You
mm,
know, tastes have descriptions. When you hear music, it very often evokes feelings, it evokes memories. All of these things are interconnected. And I think this card more than ever pays homage to that. This is about the power of words organized in a certain way, spoken, intoned with certain rituals that actually has, in this case, the power to bring us into the presence of the goddess, isn't it?
yeah,
And again, I mean, like you said, I mean, an active part of modern ritual with regards to Hecate, isn't it?
yeah.
I love it. This is at some stage, this will be printed out and framed, because I think of all the images in the deck, for me, this is the central one. It's not necessarily the central one for everyone else, but it is for me.
Yeah.
So let's move on to the final card that we're looking at in this video. Anyway, this is card 36, the chords, and the keyword on this is bondage.
Yeah.
It was I remember this as being a fairly straightforward one to do, but then again, it's just so in your face, and its meaning is so blatant that it was never going to be too difficult to do.
Yeah, and yeah, it's one of those ones that, yes, it can be interpreted literally at face value, but then there are different ways you can look at it. When we look at, or when we consider chords in relation to Hecate, sometimes she is depicted with things that look like cords or whips, or sometimes you're not sure if they're snakes, or there are allusions to possibly like umbilical cords and things like that. But also, when we think about ourselves in a modern context, we're often restricted or bound by either things in our own selves that we hold back, or by other people who we allow to have too much say or too much control over our outward lives. And so what I wanted to sort of represent with this card was this notion that, I suppose, in a way, similarly, a sort of similar energy to what you see sometimes in the Eight of Swords. This notion of, oh look, my hands are tied, and then it's like, yes, but look at all these knives around you, And to be honest, it doesn't look as though you're tied very tight, very tight. You could just do that, And who's holding all of those knives? What, is it that they're holding you hostage, or is it that they're offering to cut you free? And I wanted to sort of make it so that it's going to be very much determined by what the question is or what the situation is when this card arrives, because it can go either way. And I think, very much so that Hecate has that dual nature. She can release you from fetters and from binds, but she can also, keep things bound and keep things in their place. So, and I think with the next card in the sequence, which we'll touch on in the next video, that they kind of go hand in hand and almost complement each other quite nicely.
It's interesting. I think the thing that struck me with this again is you're kind of back to Hecate as a goddess of boundaries, because it's like you say, she can free you from things that are binding you negatively. But if you're in a situation where you're a danger to yourself, or you're endangering others, or you're stepping onto her territory and overstepping her boundaries, she will bind you. You know, and again, you're back to that. You're back to that sort of gatekeeper mentality, aren't you? And that sort of boundary keeping sense again, which is a very, very powerful and healthy thing. And not, again, it seems to be a very simple image, and it's one of those cards that if you took it out of the context of the deck, if somebody didn't know this deck and that they were just faced with this card, you wouldn't necessarily immediately associate it with Hecate, and yet it's something very central, as you've taught me. It's something very central to her nature. Well, we've done it. We've done another 6 cards.
I know. Where's the time going?
Yeah. So if we've not bored you stiff, and you do fancy joining us for the next one, and at this stage, again, we're just, everyone who's been watching, thank you for staying with us this far. But next time we'll be covering cards 37 through to 42.
Ooh, so, and there's some goodies in there.
Some real goodies in here. I've got them in my hand here, but you're not seeing them until the next video. But thank you to everyone for joining us again. And as I say, we hope you've enjoyed this as much as we have. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.